exhibition, we celebrate the genius of Bonington and whether it's Richard's 60th anniversary. Richard, my first question goes to you. Why do you think Bonington is still so little known in this country? Scholars agree that Bonington is on par with Turner Constable and the other great romantic painters. The last Bonington show, I believe, was Rose Patrick 27 years ago. Richard, what is your view on this? You hold it close to mouth.
Well, the fact is that Boningtons are scarce. There aren't many of them. He died at the age of 25, and so there are very few works by Bonington. A lot of museums do not have Boningtons. There just aren't that many. And he died so young. I don't think he had even I guess he was 25. So there aren't many Boningtons in existence. Therefore, most people haven't had a chance to see them. And one of the reasons why we've never had a major Bonington exhibition in the United States is that one of the two largest repositories of his work is the Wallace collection in London, which can't lend. So it's very difficult to have a major Bonington exhibition. I've been hoping that we would have one somewhere at the Met. But again, the fact that the Wallace can't lend makes it very difficult. Bonington was very, not only was he young, but his work, there's very little of it around. And therefore, most of the major museums don't even have a Bonington.
Well, you certainly have a lot of beautiful ones. Otherwise, we wouldn't have an exhibition.
Well, I've been very fond of Bonington, so where I could, I got them, usually in competition with Paul Mellon, which was an unfair competition. The only thing is, I think Paul Mellon used to give a limit to his agent in London. And when that limit was reached, usually I was able to go one small notch higher and get a Bonington. But as I say, most of the people haven't had a chance to see his work.
But anyway, if you were to pick several works in your collection, which one would be your favorite group?
Well, to some extent, that's what this handout is. Just a few things. As Patrick has just mentioned, and as he writes in his little introduction to the catalog here, the great collectors of Bonington over in the catalog, he says, over the last 6 decades, have been Richard and Paul Mellon. And the collection at the Yale Center for British Art now numbers about a dozen oils, about 24 watercolors and drawings, and about 36 prints. So it is a sizable collection, and we lent three things to this little exhibition, and it's wonderful to see them in such a wonderful context. But I wanted to give you a sense of some of the other treasures that are at Yale, and hence the handout. And I start the handout with Mademoiselle Rose, which is our most recent acquisition. Many of these were made in connection by Patrick when he was the curator of prints and drawings at the British Art Center. in the run-up to his show, or the immediate aftermath to his show, which I must say, and Patrick couldn't say this, but I can. I think it's the most beautiful show that the Yale Center for British Art has ever done. It was really, really a stunning show. But we do still acquire Boningtons, not very frequently, but the Mademoiselle Rose is something that we just acquired this past year, and it's a great addition to the collection. One of the things I've put in the handout are the dates when these works were acquired, and you can see that Paul Mellon was actually buying things from very early on. I mean, I don't know if you all know, but Mr. Mellon's buying of British art was a sort of late development in his collecting career. He began to collect British art seriously in the 1950s, and the late 1950s. And so you'll see there are works on that list. The Kiel book, which has always been one of my favorites, was purchased by Mr. Mellon in 1959. The Fish Market near Bologna was purchased in 1961. So, I mean, right at the very beginning of his collecting, he was adding these major works. And then it continued right through, and through the establishment of the center in 1977. He continued to buy things for the center, often at Patrick's request. And then there are, then we end up with a couple things that were purchased actually as Patrick was leaving, or just after he left, but things that he had initiated, like the use of tears, which hangs upstairs, and the wonderful view of Rouen. I've spoken long enough.
You know, it started anecdotally, but I think it's actually true that they first met in around 1819, 1820, when they were both students, basically, and they were both sketching in the Louvre. Delacroix, of course, was on scaffolding, making head studies after the marriage of King, and Bonington was sitting in the Dutch galleries making little watercolors. And that's apparently when they were introduced. And that slightly later, I'm sure, but between sort of 21 and 23, because they had different paths. I mean, Delacroix was becoming a major painter, and Bonington was actually much more interested in print trade and watercolors, and he was working primarily for print publishers and trade in Paris. And but I'm sure their paths crossed, because I mean, Delacroix was living. I mean, he was living with, but he was sharing a studio with a number of British engravers and watercolorists in 1823, and Bonington was working with the same people, so he was obviously in contact with them, but it wasn't really until 1824 when the so-called British Salon, I think, really thrust them both to the forefront of everyone's attention, because aside from Delacroix, obviously, was going to be awarded a gold medal for the Massacre of Chip, but the British side of it was Lawrence, Constable, Bonington, and one of the Fielding brothers were all getting gold medals. I mean, here's this sort of 22-year-old, coming out of nowhere, and he obviously would have made a very strong impression on Delacroix. He made a very strong impression on Delacroix and other artists. But it's not until 1825 when they all these young French artists are so blown away by what they saw at the 1824 Salon of British Art. And of course there was raging Anglo-mania in Paris, as you all know, with Walter Scott and the literary side of it. They all packed off to London for 2 months in the summer. And that's when Delacroix records that he actually became very close with Bonington, and they spent a lot of time together. They worked in the Wallace, the Myrick collection, which has all the ornament that's now in the Wallace collection. They made drawings of tomb effigies at Westminster. They probably made a number of studio visits. I don't think Bonington made all the studio visits that Delacroix did. I know he didn't go see Lawrence. I mean, Delacroix was full of himself, and he was going to go meet every major artist in London. So he went to Wilkie's studio, Constable. Turner was out of town, so he missed Turner, but later Turner visited him in Paris, and he had some nasty things to say about Turner, but he did go to see, he went to see Lawrence, because they were all enamored of Lawrence, the portrait painter. And Bonington didn't go with him on that. We know he didn't because he had a letter of introduction, but he was embarrassed to go. He didn't think he was really up to par to be able to go and talk to Lawrence. And it wasn't until a year later or so that he was actually, he got the courage to go and actually visit Lawrence. But Delacroix, and he spent a huge amount of time in theater. I mean, it was just, so when they came back, Bonington actually moved into Delacroix's studio, and they worked together for like 9 months. I mean, they were literally shoulder to shoulder, and you can see it in the work. The Seated Turk up there was done while Bonington was in Delacroix's studio, and it's so Delacroix in subject, but very, very different in technique, and he's technically very different from Delacroix, even at this point in his career. So he basically stays with Delacroix until the summer of 26, when he goes off to Venice or Italy. They do a tour with Baron Rivet, their mutual friend. And Delacroix was supposed to go on that trip, but he backed out. He said, I can't, I'm too busy, I have too many things to paint. I think he was trying to get things on exhibition in London, etc. And so he didn't go. And when Bonington came back, he moved out of Delacroix's studio and went into his own studio, which was actually the former studio of Horace Vernet and Jericho, and he was there for about 4 or 5 months or 6 months, and he moved to another studio. But he was constantly going back and forth. But I'm sure for the last 2 years of his life, or at least a year and a half, he and Delacroix were seeing each other probably on a weekly, if not a daily basis. And just you look at the subjects that they're painting, the subject matter they're both looking at that point, and there are so many parallels in what they're doing and borrowing from each other. But more important, I think, is you see Delacroix's actual technical experimentation paralleling his. I think what you have in those 2 years, 27, 28, you have these two artists who are basically, redefining painting from the ground up. And there's a huge amount of technical experimentation going on in that studio. And it's not just Delacroix and Bonington, it's that whole group of people that they were very close to. There's Paul Hewitt, there's Isabey, there's that whole group of young artists who were mostly landscape painters, but still very close to Delacroix and Bonington. And you see it in the subjects they're doing. Dick Comp is another one who's part of all that. I mean, it's quite clear when you look at their work together in Moss. And they died. And they just came down with tuberculosis, or he had tuberculosis, and then he relapsed and went off to London and passed away. Delacroix remembers him throughout his entire life, and he writes extensively about him. In fact, it's because of Delacroix and a very brief but very important biographical notice that he writes about Bonington in 1858. Torrey Berger, who was writing a history of English art, got in touch with Delacroix and says, "What's this Bonington guy?" And Gautier and all these other critics have always been talking about Bonington and his importance to you, and how Sardanapalus couldn't have been painted if it weren't for him, and what does all this mean? So Delacroix wrote a very long letter to Torrey Berger, and that's how we know all this relationship that he had with him and why it was important. And Delacroix mentions him many times in his journals over a period of years, but mostly towards the end of his life, when he's reflecting on what was important to him, and especially his contacts in England. And he admired two painters that he really admired more than anyone else were Charlotte, believe it or not, and Bonington, and it was for the same reason, because of their executive skill and In Bonington's case, was a brilliant colorist. And Delacroix always goes back to the fact that he was such a great colorist. And he understood color, and he was also this virtuoso technician, which Delacroix went between praising and condemning. You know, he was back and forth with this kind of thing. But in the end, I think he plumped down for Bonington.
Maybe Marjorie could tell us a little bit about the watercolor techniques and how they influence each other on that.
Yes, and I can understand why they spent so much time together, because Delacroix must have been blown away by the materials that Bonington was using and his facility at it. I think we have to start first with paper. Delacroix was not interested in the papers that he used for drawings, for ink and charcoal and so forth. They were inexpensive papers, that was whatever was readily available. And paper did not play an aesthetic role in the way we think of it in present-day terms, where, you know, an interesting color or flex in it, texture and so forth. It was just a carrier, but Delacroix really had not paid any attention to it, possibly because of economic reasons. But the paper that he did seem to choose all the time that was very good were the papers for his watercolors. And many of them were Whatman papers or comparable to Whatman papers. They had a very smooth surface, which meant, and in watercolor this does make a great deal of difference what type of texture. But that smooth surface meant that they had uniform absorbency. They were white. They were gelatin size, so they would just absorb so much color wouldn't sit on the surface. And that was probably one of the first things he learned, that it really did make a difference to use a paper that would not interfere with the strokes and so forth, and also was strong enough that the various reductive techniques, sponging and scraping and so forth, could be carried out without damaging the sheet of paper. I think that was one outstanding thing. The other thing was the types of additives that Bonington used, either incorporated in his paint or glazed on top. And I don't know if there's been any analysis of his materials, but it would be fascinating. There had to be at least 10 types of gums that artists were using at that time. Many people know about Blake's repertoire of was he using varnishes and shellacs and so forth, things that really don't go together. But he worked out a system. Most artists were now very much aware of gum arabic, gum sarcocola, I guess it's called, and a whole list of materials, isinglass, which is fish glue. And all of these gums had been around for centuries. They were used in illuminated manuscripts because they served different purposes. Some would harden the color to make it very enamel-like. Some would impart a very high luster. Some were there to put a barrier layer between the first layer of paint and the second layer so they wouldn't fuse together. And I have not analyzed Bonington's glossy surfaces, but all those glossy surfaces contain some sort of gum, because he was using this for his various artistic aims to make something either, well, it was to impart a gloss. In most cases when Bonington uses a gel or gum, it's to intensify the depth of tone of the dark colors. There were other reasons to use it, some of the things I just mentioned as a barrier layer and so forth. But it's very likely that it's not just one gum in his compositions. I could see by the difference in appearance. Some of them, of course, were applied very thickly, so they have a cracked lure. But these must have been some of the things that intrigued Delacroix. He doesn't talk about his watercolors very much at all throughout his journal. There are probably letters that I've misseen, but he focused on his oil paints, but he obviously had a passion for what he was able to do in watercolor, imitate any technique that was possible in oil. And there are many other things, but more questions that you have.
My next question goes to you, Asher. Basically, telling us what it's like to live with Delacroix for the last few years. I mean, you know him now better than anyone else, I believe.
Yeah, I think my wife felt that I spent more time with her actually. But no, it's been an amazing experience to get to know his oeuvre and then to sort of whittle that down into a group that tells a story or a series of stories or a clutch of stories that unfolds in a way that makes an exceedingly complex artist comprehensible to museum goers who don't know him very well, or who think they know him, or who know him in terms of one or two pictures. In my own experience, I always found it incredibly difficult to reconcile a painting, let's say our abduction of Rebecca at the Met from 1846 with Liberty leading the people, and how he goes back and forth between a subject, a contemporary subject of great import and immediacy, to a subject that is kind of ephemeral, just seemed incomprehensible to me. So, first of all, sort of simply marshaling these pictures in a way that tells a story was a revelation. But of course, now that they're on the walls, and I get to live with them every day, it's the next chapter, and it's still unfolding. And I'm now beginning to sort of bear witness to conversations between the pictures that I hadn't initially anticipated. There's a great deal of scholarship about Delacroix, but actually having the physical pictures on the walls makes all the difference in the world. And as time goes on, and I'm beginning to admit the light of from other sources into my mind, as I go through the galleries, I'm beginning to see things like the influence of Bonington in the way that, for example, if you look at the bedroom of Henri IV upstairs, and which I find to be one of the most beguiling paintings of the early 19th century, and then you look at a picture like the Amande Honorable from Philadelphia, and you see this grand space, this evocative interior, this treatment of light, the indifference of this architecture to what's enacted among the figures below. It seems to me to be, in a sense, sort of the unexpected presence of the influence of someone like Bonington in a picture like that. Looking at the Jair and Hassan from Philadelphia, Chicago, painted in 1826, which is a far more dramatic picture than Bonington would paint, as far as I know. And yet, when you see the way that Delacroix lays on the paint over a section that's, you see that amazing jacket painted in white with little bits of blue over just a ground, and he uses that ground to great effect, material effect. It's quite amazing to see, but you can begin to see the sources of it in an innovative practitioner like Bonington.
Well, the second Bonington had a very interesting backstory. A couple of summers ago, I got a call from a man from Mineral Wells, Texas, about an hour outside of Fort Worth. And he said that he had a collection that he wanted to show me. Most of the collection was bought off the internet, quite a few things from eBay, etc. I'm not sure if I would have agreed to see the collection, except for the fact that he said that he was friends with a major patron of the Kimball who lived and had a horse ranch in Mineral Wells. So I decided to look, see what he had. He also thought the Kimball might be interested in exhibiting the collection as well. So we made an appointment, and it was summer under the blazing sun of Texas. And I suggested that he bring the collection into the underground garage. Didn't want him to bring everything into the Kimball. And so he comes to the Kimball, and when I'm on my way to the garage, I swing by George Shackelford's, our deputy director's office, and say, George, why don't you come with us? Look at what he has. I wanted to deflect any anger he might have towards me when I tell him, no, we're not interested in exhibiting the collection. Also to give him a second opinion. So we go down into the garage, he starts pulling things out, and the paintings are about what you would expect. And then this one very nice view of a church interior comes out. And it was signed David Roberts. And George and I both admired it. And we took photographs with our iPhones. It's still on my iPhone, that photograph. And then we put the paintings back in his truck and drove off. And then a few days later, George was doing a Google image search for a completely unrelated reason. And lo and behold, he sees watercolor from the Wallace collection, a studio watercolor that was clearly related to the oil sketch that we had just seen a few days earlier in the garage. I go to the library, get Patrick's catalog raisonné, and it says in the entry for the Wallace collection watercolor that it was based on an untraced oil sketch painted April 11th, 1826. And Patrick knew the early history of the painting, but it had been untraced since it was in William Beckford's collection. I think early on, there were two possibilities for the early history of the painting, but I think Patrick has more or less narrowed it down to the painting that was in the William Beckford's collection. Anyway, I call the owner, had him bring the painting back out to the Kimball, call Patrick, and talk to Patrick about it. He starts asking me questions. Is it a Davies Mill board? What is the label on the back? Blah, blah, blah. And we send photographs to Patrick, and ultimately Patrick comes down to the Kimball, blesses the painting, and we buy it. And so it's, I think everyone asked, why was it signed David Roberts? Claire Barry, our conservator, cleaned the painting, and the signature was painted on top of the varnish. There was no question that it was a forged signature. But I think probably what happened, since it's a view of a church interior, it's an atypical subject. It's not a view of Venice or a coastal scene. And I think that when William Beckford's collection was auctioned off, none of these oil sketches were signed. And I think that the identity with Bonington was probably lost at that point. And then in the late 19th or early 20th century, a dishonest dealer probably forged the David Roberts signature. But the irony is that David Roberts, even then, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Patrick, Roberts was far less expensive than Bonington. So a fake Roberts signature was forged on an authentic Bonington. Anyway, it's a great story.
Thank you. It's a great story. It's every art dealer's dream. And what happens to you directly. Does anyone in the audience have a question? Where's Keith? Where's Keith? No? No question?
Just one question.
Yeah.
Years ago, I did something about Yorkie, and Yorkie used a lot of asphaltum to get his shadows very rich. Did Delacroix do that as well? Because asphaltum tends to crack after time. But was that a temptation? Did Delacroix succumb to at that point?
That I don't know, but asphaltum, yes, was very common at that time. And the condition is usually called, well, it either creeps or alligators. It breaks up into sections that have the appearance of an alligator. But that was a material that was used by many 19th century artists. Has anyone encountered it in?
Not in our pictures, no.
Yeah, I've never seen it, but sometimes closer examination makes it. Delacroix did not use any unusual materials, and it doesn't seem as if Bonington did either. It's just his combinations and layerings.
Well, Delacroix did use some unusual
Well, maybe
materials for his
it's-
paintings. For his paintings, yeah, he was always experimenting with his paintings, and that's why some of them are such a mess right now. But in terms of Bonington, we know that we've never been able to do a lot of technical analysis of Bonington's work. It just wasn't possible. But there's the evidence of his contemporaries who made it perfectly clear that when he was experimenting, Delacroix's experimentation with cocoa varnish as a medium in his oil paintings, which resulted in a lot of damage. And Delacroix himself talks about using this in the 50s, not as early as the 20s, but certainly in the 50s. And one thing that's on his mind, which really concerns him, is these things are going to be ruined because these conservators, or restorers, they were conservators, they were restorers, aren't going to know what we use. And I'm not sure that has happened. But the apocryphal information from a number of sources at the time was that this particular approach to that medium and using it in that way came from Bonington. And you see, I think if you were to look at some of these pictures from the 1820s by Bonington, so the ones in 26, 27, you'd probably find that there's evidence of that. In his oils, yeah. His watercolors were, as you said earlier, that he was using gum arabic is what he called it. Well, what it was is who knows, but he was using gum arabic a lot, and he was also using gouache with the wash drawings, which was heresy in England at the time, but was quite exciting for the French. And he was using it in a totally revolutionary and new way. So that's one of the reasons why he was so, just to kind of mix mediums, exploring different ways of using that medium.
Well, of course, Turner was using a lot of
Turner
gouache.
was,
Yeah,
Turner.
but you're right, he was.
And in France, and I'm really referring to what's going on in France because they didn't think very highly of watercolor. So, but yeah, and Bonington, of course, learned a lot when he went to England and studied all the Turner he could ingest, because he was head over heels for Turner. So he was seeing that kind of experimentation.
When he goes back to England,
When he was,
not
yeah,
when he's a young.
no, when he goes back, 'cause when he was a child, he didn't see anything really. He was in Ireland and would not have had any contact with any of those inventory events that were going on in London so frequently.
Can you talk about the influence he had on subsequent artists?
Well,
No,
well, aside from Delacroix, which is I think quite important, there was a phenomenon in France called Boningtonism, because there were so many artists who were trying to imitate his watercolor style. He's one of those painters whose style of painting was really simple and anybody can do it. And in fact, it's virtually impossible to really to duplicate that kind of perception and touch and innovatory way of using, especially watercolor. But there were a lot of artists who came over, British artists who came to Paris basically as drawing masters for the aristocracy. And they all went through the same mill. They all came by way of Louis Francia in Calais, who was a very, very important innovator in England before he moved back to Calais. He was in London during the wars and spent quite a lot of time there. Was very much involved with Girton and Turner and the other watercolors of the Society of Painters and Watercolors. When he sets up camp in Calais, which is where Bonington first met him and started to experiment with watercolor when he was a young man. A lot of these other British watercolors come through him, and then they branch out and they take these positions in the royal families and the aristocracy. I think a lot of them were basically enamored of Bonington. They're trying to imitate his style. His works were still available even after his death. And the major studio sales had taken place, but there were some major collections of his work still in Paris. The Louis Brown collection had probably the largest collection of watercolors ever assembled by Bonington, and that sale took place in the 30s. So, and Delacroix said there'll never be another assemblage of Bonington's watercolors as grand as this, which may still be true because the Wallace collection doesn't lend, but we'll try to duplicate that someday. But in terms of the French artists, I think the influence is primarily in oil painting. I think you see a lot of influence in Isabelle, Robin, Colin, all these artists who were part of his circle. It's not protracted, of course. These things are all in passing, but it's at a very crucial moment. It's right at the height of of Romanticism at that point. So it starts to fall off in the 40s and 50s, but then it's revived again in the 60s because of Delacroix. But
You're doing a Bonington exhibition for the Parkes, is that correct?
I think as of tonight, we're on to do an exhibition at the Wallace Collection for the first time. It'll be the first Bonington exhibition in London since 1935. I think 2020. Yeah, so it should be interesting.
Do you have any questions for each other?
I'd like to ask Patrick and Asher, the comments that Nottebohm makes about Bonington are very admiring, but they're also a little condescending. He uses the word charming a lot. He talks about, what is the one? He says of Bonington, I would sometimes tell him, you are a king of your domain and Raphael could not do what you do. Don't worry about other artists' qualities or the proportions of their pictures, since yours are masterpieces. And it seems to be getting at the relatively, the kind of small scale of Bonington's paintings, and also in some ways of Bonington's ambitions as an artist. I mean, he doesn't have this kind of overarching ambition to do big statements the way that Delacroix does. And I mean, how do you? Delacroix's clearly getting a lot from Bonington, but they strike me as such different characters.
But I think first of all, it's difficult to read Delacroix, and he sometimes, I don't think he intends to mean what he sometimes seems to say on its face. So if he says charmant, I don't take it as a negative. I don't think it's condescending. I think it's a positive quality, and there's a certain offhandedness, a candor that takes one by surprise in Bonington, and it comes through as understatement. And I think that's something that Delacroix not only admired in Bonington, but something that he often lacked, and he might have done better to emulate in some cases. He can be a bit bombastic at times. So I not only don't see it as a negative, but I think when you look too at Delacroix's cabinet pictures that he makes in the 20s, at the same time that he's painting these large, ambitious, large-scale pictures for the salon with the hope of them being acquired by the state and for commission, he's also all along the way painting cabinet pictures like that one with the same aims as Bonington, which is to cultivate a private clientele. And he's working in a very similar mode to Bonington, often kind of going off in a more dramatic direction, which is his way, but clearly borrowing from him in his attention to surfaces and the textiles and so forth.
No, absolutely. Delacroix goes back and forth on everybody throughout his life. He'll have very positive things to say about one artist, and then kind of critical things, not negative, but critical. He's always analyzing the influences and the people he's responding to, with the exception of Anne and Delacroix. She hated both of them and despised their work. But in terms of these other artists who were more or less in his orbit, that he was drawing from, inspiration from, or ideas from, whatever, he could go back and forth. I think that comment about your no, Raphael could not do what he would do. He was really, apparently Bonington was very, at the very end of his life, he was very concerned about the fact that he was not painting on that scale. He was actually depressed, according to Delacroix, that he wasn't painting large pictures, and the largest pictures that he did paint were at the very end of his life, the very last year. And a couple of them were Italian views, very large Italian views. But we have no way of knowing how good they were, because one was destroyed in the fire and the other one's at the Tate, and it's been totally ruined by restorers, so we don't really know, how he would have handled that scale issue. But he obviously was having issues about scale, and because he was trying to compete. There are various markets in which these artists had to compete, and Delacroix was in all. And Bonington was basically an artist who was formed by private collections. And I think his ambitions as he got older were that I really need to throw my hat into this salon arena, because that's where the money is, that's where the fame is. And I think he tried at the very end there to do that with some certain large pictures. But it would be interesting to see how he would have, his style is so based on alla prima painting and this idea of perception and execution being instantaneous, which is what Delacroix was so keen on. He said, well, that's what the gods are. If you could actually record your immediate impressions as you see them, that's really, the gods can do that. And he was one of them who could, in those cases, he and Charlotte, that's why I like Charlotte so much as well. Charlotte was, what is it about Charlotte, but it was that idea of this executive skill that these guys had, which for Delacroix legitimized the experience, and made it possible for a viewer to sort of share that experience and accept its authenticity. But I don't know how Bonington would have, I don't know that he would have come up with some kind of interesting approach to painting like Turner did, in terms of scale, creating scale on a huge scale on a very small watercolor. And so you get this impression in Turner's watercolors that these are 12 feet across, but they're actually not. But he came up with this very interesting technique for painting those pictures. We just don't know what Bonington would have done. But he was moving in the direction of using color much more than he was form. And we just, Delacroix went from there. And I think you have to assume that if they were together for any length of time, they probably would have fed off each other a bit more.
So he seems to have been less literary than Delacroix. And
Well, he was interested in medieval literature. He wasn't interested in he was interested in contemporary.
Gretz von Berliching.
Well, that's
He could have read it, right?
He could have read it in French. He could have read it in French because there was a French translation of Goethe. Delacroix was interested in Goethe, and that's why that painting was probably done in Delacroix's studio when they were together. And the fact that it belonged to Delacroix is rather interesting because it's one of the few Boningtons that Delacroix actually owned. And he records it much later in his life that he was fascinated by the fact that Bonington was such a facile and brilliant painter, but he says his hand quite often outraced his ideas. At which point, rather than try to correct it or amend it, he would just throw it out. And I think that picture, which is unfinished, is an example of where Bonington took it to a certain point, said this isn't going to work, and was going to throw it out. And Delacroix said, well, wait a minute, I'll take it, or he pulled it out of the trash bin or whatever it was. But they were in the studio together. But he didn't go back and correct, and it was all right onto the canvas in oil, and it was like what he was doing with his watercolors. And I think this is what fascinated Delacroix, that he had that talent. But that could get you into a lot of trouble.
Thank you. Are you sure no one in the audience has a question? Yes?
Hi. Given that you said you're so interested in the execution and the alla prima kind of performance with his artwork, what did you find the relationship between making watercolors of something, later making larger or smaller oils, or I know that that beautiful painting of Richard's with the water and the lake, there are two versions, I think, of that, both beautiful, but that was spectacular. But so he made different versions of similar scenes and so forth. Did you find that that was a typical practice of Bonington, or is there any kind of?
Basically, his preparatory studies for finished oil were always watercolors. Except for the Italian pictures, which he actually made those sketches on site. So that the canal scene, for instance, not Lorici, but the canal, the Lorici, the other small one you referred to, that was done on site. Those were all painted from nature, from the motif. But in these earlier landscapes, if you look for a compositional precedent for those oils, they're always watercolors. And it's my conviction that basically everything he did in oil was really conditioned by what he was doing in watercolor. And he was driven by the desire to create the same kind of effects in oil that you can get in watercolor, to the extent that you could do that. And it explains, to a great extent, his palette. It explains, especially in the earlier pictures. And then you see him developing out of that, but that's initially how he transitions from watercolor to oil. But I've never discovered a landscape sketch, for instance, that there's like one, I think, that the Met acquired, was done from nature, from Puppa. There's two of them that were done, and I just bought one for Minneapolis 2 years ago, which was also done on the same trip. But he wasn't into that kind of practice of making oil sketches like the French were. He always seems to fall back on watercolor as his models for his oils.
Well, he uses very similar techniques in his oils. He's relying a great deal on the transparency and luminosity coming from below. And all the reductive techniques, you see a comparable indication of it in his oils, where reductive meaning that he's removing paint one way or the other. In watercolor, it might be by blotting or sponging or just dragging the brush. You see the same effects that he's trying to achieve in oil. You know, of course, he doesn't have quite the same, well, he does have a lot of opacity in passages of his watercolors, so it's that same, always a contrast between texture and light and mateness or glossiness.
Actually, you were talking about the life of watercolors the other day. Maybe you could talk about them and the choices you made for the exhibition.
Well, I wanted to represent Dalkova through great watercolors, because he could be a great watercolorist, and he was a prolific watercolorist. But he comes to watercolor from oil paint rather than the other way around with Bonington. And sometimes he sort of overdoes it. His watercolors can appear overworked. But what I find really interesting is that there is a great number of watercolors, particularly in the 20s and early 30s. They're not, they're signed, they're finished works, and we know, I mean, we presume they were made for the market, but we know next to nothing about who his early collectors were in this medium. And I think we probably know a great deal more about his contemporaries in that regard, but we don't know who was buying them.
Well, thank you very much. I think we probably all have dinner tonight. This will be uploaded on YouTube, so you can repeat it every night.